Good afternoon, everyone. Hello. Hi. Welcome and thank you for coming. My name is Alicia Carter. I'm the event specialist for the Center for a Livable Future. Welcome to the 7th annual Polly Walker Ecology Fund lecture featuring Dr. Alessandro Demaio. I'm going to have a few housekeeping announcements before we start. First of all, this event is being live streamed, so thank you for sitting towards the front of the room. And if you could just please make sure that your phones are on silent or turned off, that would be great. In the interest of sustainability, we are offering an electronic program today, so if you would direct your attention to the screen, you'll notice this lovely QR code. Feel free to scan the code. There is also a tiny URL link at the bottom, so feel free to pull up the program on your mobile devices. Please keep in mind that we will have time for a few questions at the conclusion of the lecture, and we will have a couple of microphone passers on either side to pass the microphone to you for your questions. And after the lecture, we will have a reception with light fare in the gallery. Please try to pull up your ticket from Eventbrite for entry into the reception. If you happen to just walk in, please feel free to just take a photo from inside and we'll be happy to admit you to the reception. Without further ado, I will bring up the director of the Center for a Livable Future, Dr. Martin Bloom.
Thanks, Alicia. Good afternoon and welcome. I think it's a nice audience, particularly now when a lot of the students will have their exams very soon. So I'm the director of the Center for Livable Future, and I still feel very new, but I'm already here for 2 years, so I should not feel new anymore. But that's the way it goes when a field like where we're focusing on is changing very rapidly, And so being the center, the director of the center, which actually has been established about 25 years ago, focusing on the food systems and public health, particularly, looking into what we call industrial food, animal production, and all the unintended consequences. I think the center has moved on, and not only because the quality of the center and the leadership of my predecessor, Bob Lawrence, but also because of the external world that has changed quite rapidly. And it's not for nothing that the center is part of the Department of Environmental Health and Engineering under the leadership of Professor Marcia Wills-Karps. And I think it's really interesting because if you look at the new strategic planning of the department, there's a lot of focus on climate action. And in climate action, of course, the role of the food system is really important, like 20% of all the production of greenhouse gases, and looking at the water use is actually caused by agriculture. So the whole field of what I would say food systems, public health, climate, ecological environment is very critical. And it's very interesting that Polly Walker, I never met her so far, but I know she was the deputy director of CLF for a long time, was so much interested before the time actually in the ecological components of public health. And that's why I'm also very pleased to have here the Polly Walker event, and it's because of with a focus on the ecology in relationship with all the things I already mentioned. So we are very lucky today. We have Sandro here, Sandro Demaio. I know Sandro about 9 years ago. So 9 years ago I was at a meeting looking in, it's actually a Nestle meeting, an industry meeting, but an industry meeting actually discussing with the NGO community as well as with the academic world what in fact that company could do better, share, what they call share values. And it was interesting that he was 25 years old, already part of that shift of communities thinking about how can we actually change the world in a way that it's all inclusive. And it's not for nothing that a couple of years later, he was at that time at Harvard, he moved actually to the WHO as a very young professional, but already at a very high level within the system, focusing on NCDs. I don't know if people have worked in the UN, but a P4 level when you are 30 years old, that's a big accomplishment already. But in the meantime, we were still working actually for Eat Forum. And Eat Forum was an initiative by a very young physician from Norway, but the programs in Norway were very focused also on the Nordic countries with of course, Sweden and Denmark, and Gunhild Stordalen. And that was an incredible initiative. Many of the top politicians as well as top researchers from World Bank, from top universities like Harvard, very much involved, like Walt Willett, for example, trying to actually move this field to a next step. And they had many young scientists or potential scientists or at least physicians part of that whole movement. And Sandra was one of the leaders in that group. All people in their 20s, late 20s and early 30s. And I think that was, I felt really, I would say, quite honored to work with these young people. And of course, it's different when you work at the university. We have a lot of young students, but it's different when you work already at a high policy level in the UN with all these partners that you see these young people actually taking part of already changing policies and driving things forward. And I think that's what I think so interesting when we have this presentation by Sandro today, that we have a lot of really, really bright students here at Hopkins, that in fact you don't have to wait until you're 50 or 60 or 40 before actually you can translate all the knowledge you are learning here at Hopkins into real action. So I can tell a lot more about Sandro, but he's now currently working for the for the Minister of Health in Australia, running actually a big program, about $60 million a year or so, for looking into prevention methods, particularly focusing on all the different aspects of this, food system, NCDs, and nutrition. So, Sandro, I think it's enough about you. I think you should show, give us a good lecture. Yeah. Thanks.
Good morning, or afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm just going to look for the mouse. Where did it go under there? Great. Okay. So I just want to start by thanking Martin and Sean and the team at the Centre for Livable Futures for having me. I came from Australia today, and it hasn't been an easy journey. So I also want to give a shout out to Veronica, who made my journey across possible. I think I'm probably the most difficult person ever to book a flight for, although you did say that Martin comes a close second. So Martin, we might need to talk afterwards. Between protests in Hong Kong, a new job that I started a month ago, and a minister who announced she wanted me to do something very important yesterday in Australia with about 16 hours between and only one flight that could get me here on time, you made it happen, and I really appreciate your patience. So thank you, Veronica. So I'm going to talk to you about an ecological approach to growing a food, climate and health movement. I'm a physician by background. I did my PhD in public health, master's in public health, and my postdoc here in the US. And I want to talk sort of the ecological approach from two perspectives. One is the classic understanding of ecology, for which I'm not an expert, but work very closely with experts in the global health field, but also taking an ecological approach, so that sort of multi-systems, multi-level approach that many of us would know from public health. And how do we take an ecological approach to solving an ecological emergency or disaster? So I'm going to assume some sort of starting points, because I've only got 40 minutes to talk about a very big topic, and I want to actually take you through some learnings that I've had over the years around building movements in this space. So I'm going to take it as a given that you all believe in climate change. Which I know is a big if in today's day and age, but I'm also going to take it as a given that you understand that while an ecological disaster is unfolding, food systems are at the centre. As Martin said, they present or produce about 20 to 30% of global greenhouse gas emissions. They use about 70% of fresh water. They're the major driver of loss of fertile soils. They're the major driver of deforestation, and of course, even through outputs of nitrogen and phosphorus, a major driver of eutrophication and dead zones in our oceans. So there's an ecological disaster unfolding, and food systems are at the centre. But there's also an ecological health disaster unfolding which has really been the focus of my work until the last couple of years. And this is, of course, a focus on nutrition. We live in a world that's never been richer, and yet about half the planet is currently malnourished in some form. 2 billion people, 2.1 I think now, billion people across the planet are overweight or obese. 600 million of those are obese, and yet about 830 million people go hungry every night across the planet. We know that about 1 in 5 children across the planet are also stunted. And while we have our global targets, the SDGs, and people continue to ask me what the little wheel is on my lapel, which frightens me as we're now many years into the SDG era, and we have a target of ending malnutrition in all its forms. We also have targets around sustainability, land, soil, and biodiversity. We're not on track to meet these targets. And this is some data that I was involved in the State of the World's Children's Report this year with UNICEF, and they've just released this earlier in the week, and it shows that we're well and truly not on track to meet our global targets around malnutrition in young people. So we are failing young people across the planet in unprecedented numbers. And you see the levels of child and overweight obesity that we've now set, I think, 2 or even 3 global targets around that to halt the rise. We're not going to achieve that target by 2030. And we currently have 1 in 5 young people across the planet are being permanently left behind, permanently impaired, lifelong or stunted because of long-term hunger early in life. Completely unacceptable and completely preventable, and related to a global food system that is overstretched and no longer able to deliver in its current form. But what's very concerning, I think, what should be very concerning for us as sort of systems-based practitioners in global health, is that we're entering a much more complex world. I've been very involved in a Lancet series which will be released in December, looking at the double burden or the triple burden of malnutrition. And this is again from the State of the World's Children's Report, which just came out a few days ago. And it shows the complexity of the ecological sort of malnutrition challenge that we face globally. And I think the takeaway is that there are now tens of countries, many countries across the planet, rapidly developing, rapidly emerging countries for which traditionally would have gone through the classic epidemiological and nutrition transition, but now find themselves in this sort of squished nutrition transition over decades rather than centuries. And so what they're facing is a very complex new nutrition reality of multiple burdens of malnutrition at once, in addition to then the ecological challenges that the true ecological environmental crises that we touched on before. So we have these multiple disasters unfolding in tandem that countries are really struggling to respond to. But what's even more complicating is that there are actually feedback loops that are starting to develop and accelerate these challenges. And one of those is that after decades of declines, world hunger is once again on the rise, predominantly due to climate change and geopolitical conflict. We've just said climate change, a major driver of that is our global food system and the way that we have commodified, globalised, commercialised and homogenised our global food system. So we have a food system that is producing food that is as an externality, in turn producing more hunger. So another way of interpreting that is the way that some of us eat in our parts of the world is literally locking more and more people out of the food system in other parts of the world. And of course, conflict as well. World food prices have been closely linked to many of the geopolitical conflicts over the last decade, including the Arab Spring. So I suppose the take-home of the start of this lecture, and this is started by slide 5, we have to just all agree on this because we only have 40 minutes, but if we can get it right on food, we can get it right for people and planet. And that's really the starting point of then, well, how do we do that? Because, you know, there will be no silver bullets. We'd love there to be, and anyone who tells you that there is, maybe look at who they're funded by or what they're trying to sell you. But, you know, it comes back to that ecological approach. These are super wicked challenges that are superimposed on each other, and they're going to require multiple solutions across multiple sectors and multiple levels. there will be no single silver bullet. But and this for me is well illustrated by the analogy of the gorillas, because unlike the era that maybe our professors and even our grandparents went into in public health, the major global health challenges half a century ago were largely technical challenges. They were challenges with known solutions that we needed to scale, and the issue was around scale, achieving scale and maintaining scale. But the challenges that we're talking about today are actually adaptive challenges. They're challenges for which we don't have known solutions. And so we need to iterate, we need to find solutions. And if we use the same, if we try to simply scale the solutions we have, we will not get to where we need to be. And the analogy of the gorilla is helpful because traditionally or evolutionarily, when a group of gorillas come under attack, they band together and the largest male goes out in front and defends the pack. Now that works very well when it's been 60,000 or 200 million years of evolution and the challenges are other animals. It doesn't work so well when the challenge or the threat is a hunter and suddenly everyone is in the same place and in the firing line. And that's the sort of change in approach that we have. The traditional models, the traditional business as usual approaches will not work, will not get us to where we need to be in solving these big challenges. We actually need to take an adaptive approach. And finally, not only do we have unprecedented challenges superimposed on each other, unfolding all at once and highly interrelated, but we have a political economy that is quite toxic and quite difficult to navigate in many parts of the world, including where I'm from. And so we need to find the scale of political, not even apathy or the lack of political willingness, but in fact the inertia, the ability for us to even just start to get movement, let alone keep movement going, is immense. And so that's where the power of a movement comes in. How do we create a mass calling, a mobilisation, a resonation across the ecosystem? So that was all to get us to the start of the lecture. Hope you've enjoyed the ride so far. It's a bit like a roller coaster. But these are sort of 5 lessons that I've learnt over the 10 years of working in global health and trying various things. And I'll present a few things. There are going to be some videos along the way, partly because I just got off a red eye from Phoenix at 5 a.m. this morning, and partly because it's also you guys giving up your time on a Wednesday. But these are 5 lessons that I've learned that I think are critical if we really want to build and mobilise a movement around what are highly interrelated ecological disasters. So the first lesson would be probably not news to many of you, but kind of makes the global health nerd inside us feel a bit sad, because we'd love this not to be the case. But, published science alone will not save us. While published science, the number of published articles in the world continues to rise, so does CO2 levels and global malnutrition. And while published science is necessary, it's not sufficient. It's not going to get us sort of the movement, the discussions that we need. Largely, it continues to be shared in the same echo chamber. And so we need to be thinking about, well, what beyond published science? If published science is sort of the first third of the process, what is the rest? And we need to be moving our focus as global health experts, physicians, activists, and even scientists to the art of translation. So when we were launching in January the Lancet Commission, which is basically 60,000 words written by 37 of the world's leading scientists, over 2 years we gave them the question, can we feed 10 billion people by 2050 to have a healthy population on a healthy planet? The answer was yes, and it was, as always, a big, long document written in the Lancet, which is really exciting for about 3% of the population, and the rest don't even know what the Lancet is and probably don't need to, and many can't even access it. Most of the planet can't access it. So when we were launching the Lancet series, and what I think was the success to it becoming one of the most media-covered pieces of literature of all time in the world, including multiple pieces in the New York Times and diet, journalists around the world road tested the diet and all sorts of other things that unfolded, was the set of translational products that we developed alongside the Lancet report itself. So there was this report in the Lancet, but we had a summary document that was about 12 pages with a load of really engaging, simple to understand graphics. This is not the most simple to understand, but I think it's a compelling one. We had that in 9 languages, including all the UN languages. As soon as the document went live on the Lancet website, we had all 9 languages, including Chinese, Russian, Spanish, the Nordic languages, because we were based in Norway, live on our website. We also produced a key set of policy documents. So most policymakers will not read the Lancet. They want something glossy, bright, colourful, and they want everything on one page, preferably. So we created a series of policy briefs specifically for communities we know we wanted to target. So for the food service providers, for the food producing communities, farmers, as well as those in agriculture, we produced a one-pager that said, what do you need to know and what can you do, based on the Eat Lancet. Then they can go and read the whole report, or they can read the summary document. And again, they're all available in 9 languages. And that led to 5,800 unique articles written about the Lancet Commission science in the first 2 weeks. One of the most publicised pieces of science in history. This is a graph that we produced. This was not in the Lancet, but it has been used again and again around the world. And put alongside then Southeast Asia, you see that a huge part of the world is under-consuming animal source proteins. But for a big part of the world, we need to be really rethinking what's on our plate if we're going to achieve Paris and also the SDGs. This is another one that I love that we've seen, probably you've all seen a million times, but I just think it's a really powerful graphic. It tells us a whole story in one graphic. If food waste alone was a country, it would be the 3rd largest emitter of greenhouse gases on the planet after China and the USA. And this tells a story of the food system's role in climate change and greenhouse gas emissions. It also tells the scale of food waste. It connects those dots in people's minds, and it gets people interested and excited, and it's very shareable. But we didn't just stop there. When we produced the 60-page report and all the translational assets, we also partnered with a German animation house who we were all a bit obsessed with at the time, and I can't pronounce the name of, but some of you might know it. And they produced a 60-second animation that distilled 2 years of work by 37 scientists. So I'll let the animation now tell you the findings of that report.
You know the saying, you are what you eat. But the way we currently eat is in fact ruining our health, the health of others, and that of the planet. Unhealthy food is now deadlier than alcohol, drug and tobacco use combined. 2.1 billion people are overweight, yet we eat more sugar, fat and red meat than ever. Still, 821 million go to bed hungry every night. On top of that, our food is the main cause behind species extinction and 1/3 of all global greenhouse gas emissions. So, can we feed a growing population without destroying the planet and ourselves? Science had no clear answer to this question. That's why EAT gathered 37 of the world's best scientists to determine what a healthy and sustainable diet is and how to get there. The result is the Lancet Commission, a scientific blueprint for a healthy and sustainable future. If we change the way we produce, consume, transport and waste food, we can feed everyone a healthy diet while improving the health of our planet. What does this look like? Meat can stay on our plate, but plants need to be the new main course. We should eat a huge variety of fruits and vegetables and a low amount of meat, dairy and seafood. We should choose unsaturated fats and stay away from refined grains, highly processed foods and added sugars. And we have no food to waste. It will take huge changes, but following this plan will lower our risk of cancer, strokes and diabetes. It could help avoid 11 million adult deaths per year. In fact, consuming and producing food more efficiently and mindfully will help to keep our planet flourishing. We have an answer now. We know the right course for a better future. It's on us to actually take that step. Our food can be the key to solving the biggest challenges we face. Food really can fix it.
So it's 4 words. We distilled, 60,000 words down to 4 words. Now, there are lots of people who want those 60,000 words, and they're available. And again, I think the Eat Lancet report is now the most downloaded Lancet Commission that they've ever had. But for those who don't have the time or don't have the interest, we distilled it down to a short animation. The next really important learning was around, in terms of going beyond the science, is how we present the science itself. And this was now going back 5 or 6 years, or 7 years in fact, to the first time we tried to build a social movement. And this was around non-communicable diseases. So it was 2011. I was doing my PhD in Mongolia, fieldwork in Mongolia, but based in Copenhagen, and I was about to meet Martin for the first time. I didn't know that yet. And we realised that despite the entire planet dying from the same group of preventable diseases, no one was talking about NCDs. And it wasn't really a huge surprise. I mean, it's a biomedicalised sort of complex structure that was created by a group of nerds like us in Geneva, and that really doesn't resonate with the entire planet. I mean, it's called non-communicable. It starts with something that it's not. It's not a very good framing, but it's what we had. So we thought, well, rather than putting numbers which don't seem to resonate, 2/3 of deaths, tens of millions of people, we would crowdsource narratives from around the world. So you have to understand that this campaign was run before Instagram. It was before even really, I didn't even have an iPhone back in this day. I know those days existed. I don't know how we did anything now in retrospect. But this was a campaign that we ran over a month, and it was funded through an Indiegogo campaign that paid for the whole thing. And we basically put a call out to the world: send us your stories if you're affected by, or if you're working in an area relating to NCDs. It was slightly less nerdy framing than that, but this is what we got back. Okay, so that was lesson number 1, going beyond the science translation. The second is around framing, and the idea that framing will make or break us. And framing is really the way that you kind of wrap up what you're really passionate about. So deep down, I'm passionate about making sure that no child on this planet is left behind simply because of the deck of cards they've been given in life, their postcode they find themselves born in, or their income. And my main focus is around chronic disease. But the way I frame this has changed and has to change if we want to really engage a global audience and also a political economy. So as practitioners, I think we need to be agnostic to our framing. So we need to be open to changing the way we package our message to resonate and to get cut through in a very, loud and confusing and noisy world. But we also need to be humble to our own norms. And what I mean by that is the concept of NCDs, non-communicable diseases, or even healthy and sustainable food systems, that's not going to resonate with a lot of people in our society. And if we truly want to get impact and change and not just beat our own drum, then we need to be open and humble to taking the message in a form that resonates with those that we want to engage and drive change with, rather than simply sticking to our own guns. And so be guided by impact. And this has really been my journey. So I started as a clinician working in an emergency department in a big tertiary hospital in Melbourne in Australia, and working in remote communities, in Indigenous communities across the top end of Australia. And what I noticed was in the richest communities and in the poorest communities in Australia, people were dying from the same group of preventable diseases. I then found myself in Sri Lanka after the Boxing Day tsunami, doing some aid work in Mongolia and Cambodia, doing my research, and realised the entire planet was dying from this same group of preventable diseases. And then when I looked at the risk factors for these, I realised that actually there was huge overlap between the risk factors for chronic disease and what was driving climate change. Unhealthy, processed, commodified diets, active, passive transport, driving cars instead of walking, and what I realised was, in fact, the framing of climate change at that point was a very powerful way of talking about chronic disease. One sounds as though, one sounded preachy. It's like we're going to take away your soft drink, your soda. The other one was we're concerned about the state of the planet. But actually, the solutions were the same. So I didn't care which one. I mean, I'm passionate about both. I care about the future of our planet and the societies that live on it. So I'm happy to talk in a way that will relate to the audience that we're trying to speak to. So my narrative changed from a global health narrative to more around how can we integrate the burgeoning concerns around climate change. And then I realised that actually both of these converge at food. That the food system fundamentally drives a lot of climate change. It's also the biggest single risk factor for disease across the planet now, and where I come from in Australia, and that we have this growing complexity of malnutrition that we're simply not standing up to as a planet. Then I realised, the socialist in me living in Denmark for a few years, realised that in fact underscoring our food system, globalisation, and most of the big challenges was actually a false economic model, one that externalised the costs of doing business for tomorrow, and those costs included obesity and climate change. They were externalities that our modern economic system doesn't take into account, and therefore it leads to market failure and overproduction, overconsumption, and runaway climate change and obesity. Now, everyone in the audience is now starting to think, God, we're covering too much ground here, and that's literally the reaction that I could see everyone was having, and realise that this framing was too big. To be talking about our economies when I'm trying to get people to act on diabetes just seemed too big picture. So then I realised I'd gone too far and brought the framing back to where there was kind of the sweet spot of, people can understand it, they don't feel blamed, they feel empowered because we all have a plate in front of us, or most of us, if we're lucky, at least 3 times a day, but it's a common point for multiple challenges. And so if we look at food as an ecological movement, why is food a fabulous way of trying to address some of these big challenges? Well, first of all, it's a point of convergence in complexity. As I said, we have an SDG agenda. We have 17 goals and 169 targets to accomplish in 11 years. That's frightening. Okay, we're not on track to achieve them. But food is probably our single best bet of achieving most, or as many of them as possible. From gender equality, women are the last to eat and the first not to eat, and take the majority of burden of food production, all the way through to ocean sustainability. Food is a tool, a symptom, and an entry point. People understand it. It's a threat, but also an opportunity, and it's democratising and inclusive. Again, we all do it multiple times a day. So this then led us to think in Australia, well, how can we engage a wider audience in these discussions? And, many of us would think, okay, let's get a group of scientists together and establish a scientific conference. We decided to take it on a slightly different journey and instead launch a food festival. And so we launched this food festival in 2015. I'll show you the video, but I'm just conscious of the time. But the idea was really, to focus a food festival, use food as a language to discuss the 3 biggest challenges facing our society: chronic disease, social isolation, and climate change. but 3 discussions, 3 conversations that society just did not want to have at that time. And so instead, in Melbourne, a food-obsessed city, we used the language of food and a food festival to basically like Trojan horse a scientific conference into the living rooms of everyday people.
The reality is that we have a seriously flawed, even broken system. The world we live in today, the way we live, the way we control our economies, the way we make and eat food, the way we design cities, all of these things are making us sick. It's time to throw out everything we accept and challenge the way we actually live. In early 2015, a group of young people came together, concerned by the lack of meaningful action addressing our biggest collective challenges, and backed by leading Melburnians. They set about creating Festival 21. Exploring our indispensable connection to food, Festival 21 will table, digest, and seek solutions to some of our greatest contemporary challenges: climate change, chronic disease, and a disintegration of social trust and contract.
Keep moving because these are a bunch of Australians who you're going to be like, who are these people? And yes, one of them was my dad. Framing continues though with language, and so we're doing a lot of research at the moment in Australia understanding how the language we use, how does that change the engagement that we get with the public. So if we're really wanting the public to understand whether it's biodiversity, soil health, gut health, or human health, early nutrition, we need to be really careful and purposeful with our language. And one really great example of that is the 2 words in front of you, which to the public when we do dial testing mean very, very different things. So we often talk about making the healthy choice the easy choice. The industry does as well, and there's a reason. It's because when we talk about the choice, the problem is internalised with the individual. When we talk about an option, the problem is then conferred on the environment. It's about what's available to us, not what we're choosing to do. So we find in dial testing in Australia that these 2 words are interpreted incredibly differently, and that big group in the middle that are persuadable, about 75% of the population who don't feel strongly for or against public health interventions, react very, very differently depending on the framing, even down to the single word. The third is that we have to collaborate with those outside our echo chamber. So I always ask myself, and this was a question that was asked to me recently, and I think it's a great framing. We often talk about health in all policies, or we might talk about climate in all policies. But to me, it's a kind of very arrogant way of approaching the policy sector, because at the end of the day, we should be saying, why does the Minister for Finance, or why does the Treasurer, or why does the Governor deserve 30 seconds of my time? How am I going to make their life easier with what I'm trying to achieve? And so when we were, again, about a year and a half after the first campaign you saw the face with NCD Free, which is the first social movement we built, we were wanting to bring together young change makers around the world in different cities, sort of the leaders of tomorrow, but before they were siloed off and sort of blinkered to their own sector. And we wanted to bring them together and basically indoctrinate the concept of NCDs so that they would be champions in the future. Of course, they don't like it if you frame it that way, which is fair enough. So instead of calling it an NCD seminar or whatever else, we launched what we called boot camps, which were framed around leadership, innovation, and global health. Most people came for the first 2. And we held these in cities across the planet. We've held about 25 to date in all different cities across the planet. We usually have about 150 young people come, and there's all sorts of different elements, including co-creating a solution and then pitching it back to each other. And one of them we would usually turn into a short film or an advertisement. And instead of showing you the video of the boot camp in Indonesia, I'll let you watch that in your own time. This lecture is available as a link online and also through social media. Lesson number 4, I think, is, never stop iterating. Whatever works today is not going to work tomorrow, and new priorities, new political changes, the volatility of our political economy is going to continue to change, and so we need to be agile and change with it. And really I think, for people who are going through public health training, we're entering a world that looks very different from public health 50 years ago. The challenges that we're facing, Margaret Chan, the former Director General of the World Health Organization, famously said, unlike malaria, tobacco has a lobby group. There was no one. What was the quote? Mosquitoes couldn't hire lobby groups, and no one was going to sue you, if you handed out bed nets. And we live in a world today where tobacco companies do have very powerful lobby groups, where Monsanto and others do have very powerful lobby groups, and they will sue governments if they try to impinge or limit the uptake of a practice that is designed by purpose to kill 1 in 2 of its users, tobacco use. So it's a very, very different world that we're entering, and so we need to be very different practitioners, very different public health practitioners. We need to look and feel and breathe and think in a very different way from the technical world that we, have come from. And so this is why I have this kind of crazy collection of different things that I do in my spare time. I run Australia's largest prevention agency. It's a statutory body with the government, but I also do a bunch of other things just to have a bit of fun in the meantime. I co-host a television show on Netflix. It's available to 130 million people worldwide. It started its life on the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. I don't know if you have one of those here, but it's kind of like the BBC in Australia. So it's called Ask the Doctor, and as I say, it's available on Netflix. We've also launched multiple podcasts. We're currently putting together a new podcast really around sort of ecological health and food systems were the first 2 podcast series. We're now launching another one around food heroes and looking at sort of how heroes in the food system are launching different narratives and different movements. I've done a whole bunch of social work with, again, ABC and others. We actually did Skype interviews where a comedian was asking me a bunch of questions about health and like simple tips on living healthily, and they were wrapped up with animations and mainly focused at sort of trying to engage younger people in health promotion messages. And then I had the opportunity of publishing a book last year, which is a cookbook. All the proceeds go to charity, but it was really about giving clinicians a simple tool that they could give their patients. It's half nutrition information. It also has some interesting information about ocean health and sustainability of seafood and those sorts of things that a lot of people are wanting to know more about, but find quite daunting. And then 110 original recipes. And all of the money from all of these different projects, I don't keep myself. I keep my wage, but everything that I earn that's not from my core day job. This is just a clip from Ask the Doctor. You can watch that later. Is actually going to a small foundation that I established in Australia, and in about a month and a half, we're launching an accelerator program. So we need to not just be rethinking kind of the way we're doing business, but completely rethinking, I think, the business model of public health. And so we're partnering with a health insurer in Australia because we can use their data, their size, and their ecosystem. To launch an accelerator program which will take 8 prevention-focused startups through. And this will include startups in the food system space that are focused on ensuring that how we're eating is supporting our environment and supporting our farmers for the future. And so that will kick off next year. And finally, number 5, and I've got 5 minutes left. This is perfect. I'm actually, for the first time in history, running on time, probably because I skipped 2 videos. But lastly, and I think Martin is a real sort of guru or very skilled in this, but we need to continue to connect the dots. These are big, complex challenges. And if you think about even things like antimicrobial resistance, So we live in a world where global health is dominated by a security discussion. You know, humanitarianism, morality, these are not discussions that are going to get large amounts of funding for creating a sustainable food system or protecting our ecology for the future. But antimicrobial resistance is getting huge amounts of money, including from your government. So how is antimicrobial resistance linked to what we're passionate about? Well, 70% of global antibiotic use is used in the food system. So if we're actually going to make inroads on protecting our ecology for the future, and we want to use the political momentum that we have now and not lose the gain that we've made over the last 10 or 15 years from previous political cycles and political economies, one narrative that we can use to try and continue that momentum is to actually use the security language to say, well, if we're serious about tackling antimicrobial resistance, then we need to actually be also looking at our agricultural practices that are inextricably linked to the health of our natural resources, to the health of our water supplies, to the health of our soils, and of course to biodiversity. So antimicrobial resistance is critical and can be a really key political language for us to be using. I think the other one that's really interesting me at the moment is single-use plastics. Again, it's like, what is the connection between what we're talking about today and single-use plastics? Well, as a person who's working in public health in Australia, it's been really fascinating over the last couple of months. We live in a political economy in Australia where we can't get a sugar tax. You know, we're not even at the state level, because unlike here, it's actually not possible for us to get a tax on sugary drinks or soda at the local jurisdictional level. But what's been really interesting is that there's a big focus and a momentum around reducing single-use plastics. Now, we know that the future of the planet is not going to be determined by single-use plastics. It's a very important issue, but it's not the defining issue of our generation. Having said that, what is wrapped in single-use plastic? Ultra-processed foods, high in salt, fat and sugar. So if we can use the narrative of single-use plastics to get political action on ultra-processed foods, which have a huge burden on our natural environment, natural resources, but also pay a big toll on the health of our populations, then again, it's a narrative, a political window, an opportunity that we can use to continue to move this agenda forward in a very difficult political economy. And that's all I have. Thank you, Joyce.
We now have a few minutes available for questions and answers. So if you would like to ask Sandra a question, please feel free to raise your hand and we'll have someone bring a microphone over to you.
I feel quite daunted taking questions from students at the Hopkins School of Public Health. As an Australian growing up, this seems like a very scary thing to do. But anyway, let's give it a go. No, she's leaving. Oh, you're the microphone holder. I thought you had a question.
So I'm curious if you have an opinion, especially in America. We've seen a lot of these meat-based alternatives come up, things like the Impossible Burger. And they are like meat alternatives, but they're also very highly processed in their own ways. And where do they kind of fall on like the sustainability and health scale?
Yeah, it's a great question. So you have to kind of unpick that a little bit. So first of all, there are big parts of the world that currently don't consume enough meat. So the narrative that we need to reduce our meat consumption to kind of save the planet is true for our parts of the world. And those reductions are probably going to be quite dramatic. But for big parts of the world, including Southeast Asia and young women in Southeast Asia and parts of Africa, getting access to greater but more sustainable sources of animal source protein is really, really important. Secondly, you know, it's a mixed bag, the animal source, the meat alternative sort of group. I think it's brought up an important discussion, and I wonder if in a way what Michael Bloomberg, yay Bloomberg, I thought I'd get more of a reaction. Come on, guys. If what Michael Bloomberg did in New York, even though he didn't get the sugar tax, he started a really big, important global discussion, and then like romped it home in many other jurisdictions around the world and kind of created a political opportunity. And I think what this might do is it might give a solution to very affluent parts of the world. It might change the aspirational nature of meat slightly in emerging economies, which would be a good thing, particularly middle class and upper class parts of emerging economies. But it might also shift the kind of political narrative a little bit and start to get a bigger discussion around food systems and climate change. Because if politicians realise, if they taste the Impossible Burger, by definition, they're having to think about, well, why do we even have an Impossible Burger? And what are the challenges that are leading to this innovation? And why is this share going, skyrocketing? And where are the opportunities? Not to play down the fact that in Northern Europe and California, the meat alternative markets are enormous and growing. We need to be careful of some of the health effects. Often they're very high in salt, and for our bodies, they're not necessarily very healthy. It's a mixed bag, and I think the science is not yet in. But it shows that there's a demand, and I think what will happen is, possibly a country like China will invest heavily, and that's usually what happens. Northern Europe, California, no offense to Maryland, but Northern Europe and California sort of try something, then a country like China comes in, scales it, completely changes the ball game, and then it starts to really make global inroads. But we do need to be careful of the health consequences, and also not leaving an important population behind, which is the women and children in particularly Southeast Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for a very engaging discussion, and this encapsulates a lot of the things we've been discussing here as well. My question for you is, we've pointed to the economics and the big role it plays in many of these problems. So do you have any suggestions on how we engage food industry in changing things, both so they can be viable, but also in providing healthier options?
So, again, the food industry is a very diverse group, because we're including the 500 million smallholder farmers on the planet who still produce the majority of the world's food, all the way through to the big 100 companies that produce 75% of global processed foods. Let's assume for a second we're talking about the big 100. Even in there, I think there are important opportunities to be working with industry at various stages of the kind of policy to implementation, evaluation and scale process. So I think there are some really exciting opportunities to work with food providers, people who make food but don't necessarily, people who make meals but don't necessarily make food. There aren't the same conflicts of interest. I think there are also opportunities to be working directly with farmers. We've seen in a number of political jurisdictions around the world, farmers are becoming vocal advocates for climate change, for soil health, for biodiversity, for water conservation, and previously hadn't been terribly engaged in that discussion, but also very powerful politically. So I think there's an opportunity to work there as well. I think food retail is also a really exciting place to be finding opportunities to align. At the end of the day, if we can build models for food retail so that they sell the food that is going to make populations healthy, but they can continue to make profits, therefore kind of retitrate, the layout, the lineup, the placement, but also the product lines, they're not necessarily beholden to a certain, product or food type. But when it comes to the food manufacturers, which is, the really thorny discussion, and also the big ag companies like Monsanto, I think that's very difficult, and I think we have to be very, very careful. We've learnt, the hard way from the petroleum industry, what they will do to, confuse, lobby, create fake scientific platforms, produce fake research. The big food companies have done exactly the same thing and have really delayed and confused the conversation for many, many decades. So I think we have to be very careful there. But even in that mixed bag, there are probably some areas that we can be engaging, but we just have to be very, very careful. And probably it's more at the, once the policy is set, once something is decided based on evidence, the implementation, the time scale, and maybe some things around sort of feasibility and scalability, they're the areas where industry can be quite involved because they have data, they have access, etc. Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming to speak with us today. When we talk about climate change and non-communicable disease and unhealthy diets, they tend to affect either people who didn't contribute to the problem or who are poor and have, or lower socioeconomic status and have less ability to really change that. And so there's this big issue of equity when we're talking about this. And I'm wondering if you have found ways to message that in a way that doesn't sound preachy and what kind of dots you think we can be connecting to address equity better in this. Yeah, I mean, this is a huge focus of our work. And again, in 40 minutes, it's hard to cover everything. But absolutely agree, intergenerational equity as well as current equity across socioeconomics within a country, within a community, but also globally. It's a huge challenge. I mean, as I said before, when you frame it as the way that we eat in certain parts of the world is locking tens of millions of more people globally out of the food system every year through climate change and conflict, it's a very different narrative than world hunger is on the rise. We have done some testing, and I can share this afterwards, but certainly that big group in the middle, the persuadables, so there's the kind of diehards who will never agree with us, and there's the diehards who, have, our messages printed on their chests, of which I obviously have that under my shirt. Then there's like 75% of the public in the middle, and we find that when we message it, when we talk about a ban, or we talk about eliminating anything, pretty much universally the support goes down. When we talk though, so we were looking recently at some data around advertising, and we said if we ban junk food advertising on public transport, the support goes down. If we talk about public transport free from unhealthy product advertising, that same group in the middle, and particularly lower income groups, the support goes up. Same concept, just a slightly changed narrative. The other thing I would say is that we have to be really careful of unintended consequences, and we all talk about, that seems like the latest cliche, but these policies can very easily be regressive. And I think we can learn a lot from countries around the world that have implemented, for example, fiscal policies in a really clever way that either is hypothecated, so the money is used to advantage the poor the most, but also we have to be careful that those that benefit the most from the policy directly are also the poorest. And this is what we saw in Mexico, for example. We saw the greatest reductions in the lowest income groups, so they benefit from the tax itself. They don't continue to consume unhealthy products. They're the first to actually change behaviours, but also the money was used to provide clean drinking water. Philadelphia, it was used in early child, as I'm sure you're aware, physical activity and early child education. So it's making sure that, whatever policies we're implementing, equivalent, in the farming sector, we need to be making sure that we're not benefiting the big agri businesses at the cost of the world's smallholder farmers. We need to be building policies and solutions that every time we ask ourselves the question, what is likely to be the unintended consequences? And if we realise there are true unintended consequences, we iterate and build something in to protect the most vulnerable. So yeah, it's a really good question. Yeah.
Me? Okay. So given that food is something that creates a lot of passions and it's usually seen as a moral issue, I feel that sometimes the lack of support that NCDs have received is because there is this perception outside of the public health people that NCDs is something that well, it's a consequence of bad decisions,
Yeah.
right? And we have tried to change this perspective by promoting the discourse of, well, you live in a food system and that constrains your choices. But there's also still this very wide belief that even in that, when you live in that environment, it's a moral issue, the choices that you make.
Yeah.
So I feel that it's so difficult to change this mindset of, well, you are sick because you brought this onto yourself, right? So as opposed to undernutrition that has received a lot of support because there's not this discourse of personal choice. What do you think we can do to change this perspective? And I know it's very difficult, but I feel that...
there's no silver bullet and it's many of the same things, but I completely agree. The clip that I didn't show you from the Netflix show, we tried to frame the challenge in a way that sort of resonates with an everyday listener. So I often use the analogy of a classroom when people tell me that it's because individuals are stupid or are lazy that we have an obesity epidemic. And I'm not even sure that, talking about it as an obesity epidemic is really the best framing either, but let's just short on time. But, I usually use a classroom analogy. So, if you had a class of 30 students and one of them was getting bad grades, then you could understandably assume that it's an issue that is resting with that single individual. But if you had a classroom of students and 2/3 of them were failing, there is no one in their right mind that would say, oh, well, 2/3 of the class is stupid or lazy. You'd be looking at the lighting, you'd be looking at the teacher, you'd be looking at the curriculum, you'd be looking at environmental and structural factors. And yet we live in a community on a planet where increasingly 2/3 of adults are overweight or obese. In Australia, 1 in 2 young adults are now overweight or obese, and 40% of low-income community kids in Australia under 5 are overweight or obese. And yet we continue to somehow blame the individual, which seems ludicrous. So I think we need to kind of take back that narrative, but also be more effective in framing it in a way that people can understand. And I think we also need to be really careful about our language. I think if we talk about choices, it perpetuates the individualisation, the blame, shame narrative. I think if we talk about options, it very much changes, and we see that with our population testing. Yeah.
Thank you, Sandro.